The soft, amber glow of the quiet restaurant fell across the table like a secret. Sophia Laurent, a woman of elegance and power, sat with her back straight, her hand resting near a wine glass she hadn't touched. Opposite her sat Daniel Hayes, a simple man in a faded shirt with deep, observant eyes. For several long seconds, silence was the only guest. The faint clink of a spoon against a porcelain plate echoed sharply in the stillness. Sophia took a shallow breath, looked directly into his eyes, and whispered, "Is my age a problem for you?" Daniel Hayes was a man built from quiet corners and the steady hum of machinery. At 37, he possessed a weary kind of handsomeness, a face etched with the patience of someone who spent his days fixing what others had discarded. As a senior maintenance technician, Daniel didn't seek the limelight. His world was small, contained within the four walls of a modest house that always smelled faintly of cedarwood and cinnamon. His life was anchored by one person, his 7-year-old daughter, Lily. Every morning, Daniel's routine began before the sun touched the horizon. He would quietly brew a pot of coffee, the steam rising in the dimly lit kitchen as he packed a lunchbox with heart-shaped sandwiches, a small gesture that Lily adored. He worked double shifts at various industrial sites, his boots caked in dust, and his hands scarred from years of battling rusted pipes and stubborn electrical grids. He was a man of few words, preferring the honest feedback of a well-tuned engine over the complex, often deceptive, nature of human conversation. Their home was a gallery of Lily's life. Drawings were taped to every available surface, colorful scribbles of suns with faces and trees with purple leaves. But there was one drawing on the refrigerator that Daniel looked at every night before bed. It was a family portrait. There was Daniel, tall and stick-like, and Lily, small with a bright yellow dress. Beside them, there was a noticeable gap, a white space where a mother should have been. Daniel's wife had passed away when Lily was just a toddler, leaving him to become both the provider and the protector. He was a man who felt stable, but half empty, moving through life with a heart that had learned to function in the cold, prioritizing his daughter's happiness over his own loneliness. Sophia Laurent was the opposite of Daniel's quiet world. At 45, she was the CEO of Laurent Global, a conglomerate that dictated market trends and commanded respect. She was successful, fiercely independent, and profoundly lonely. Her life was a series of glass-walled boardrooms and high-rise apartments that felt more like museums than homes. She had spent decades building an empire, sacrificing her youth and her personal life to prove herself in a male-dominated world. But lately, the silence in her penthouse had become deafening. She had realized that the throne she sat upon was surrounded by a moat of isolation. Every relationship she had ever known was conditional, based on what she could provide or who she represented. They met in the most mundane of ways. A critical cooling system had failed in the server room of Laurent Global's headquarters. Daniel was the lead technician sent to handle the emergency. When he arrived, he didn't care about the prestige of the building or the expensive art in the lobby. He just cared about the pressure gauges in the vibrating pipes. Sophia had walked into the server room, frustrated by the delay and the heat, expecting to see a frantic team. Instead, she found Daniel, alone, grease-stained, calmly recalibrating a valve while humming a soft melody under his breath. She stood there for a moment, watching him work. He didn't look up when the door opened. He didn't offer the practiced smile of a subordinate. He just worked. When he finally noticed her, he didn't realize she was the CEO. He saw a woman who looked exhausted, someone whose shoulders were carrying more weight than they were meant to. "It'll be back up in 10 minutes, he said simply, wiping his forehead with a rag. "You should sit down. You look like you haven't slept in a week, and the air in here isn't helping." Sophia was stunned. No one spoke to her with such blunt honesty. They either feared her or flattered her. But Daniel Hayes just saw a human being in need of rest. That small spark of authenticity was the beginning. A few days later, Sophia did something impulsive. She found his contact information in the vendor files and invited him for coffee. She told herself it was to discuss a long-term maintenance contract, but deep down, she knew it was because he was the first person in years who hadn't tried to impress her or ask for a favor. They met at a small, unassuming cafe far from the financial district. Sophia arrived in a tailored suit, looking every bit the titan of industry, while Daniel arrived in his work uniform, smelling of ozone and metal. "Why did you call me?" Daniel asked, leaning back in his chair and eyeing the expensive car parked outside. "Because," Sophia replied, stirring her sugarless espresso, "you're the only person who hasn't lied to me this month. You told me I look tired. Everyone else tells me I look formidable. I think I prefer the truth, even if it's unpleasant." Daniel smiled, a slow, genuine movement that reached his eyes and softened the rugged lines of his face. "Well, you still look tired, but the coffee might help, or maybe a day off. Have you tried those?" As the weeks turned into months, their meetings became more frequent. They didn't go to the five-star restaurants Sophia usually frequented. Instead, they found themselves in corner diners where the coffee was cheap, walking through public parks as the leaves changed color, and sitting on weathered benches watching the sun dip below the horizon. Sophia began to shed the heavy armor of her title. She stopped checking her phone every 2 minutes. She started to breathe again. Daniel shared the story of his life with a raw vulnerability that Sophia found intoxicating. He talked about the loss of his wife, the terrifying first year of being a single father when he didn't know how to change a diaper, and the way Lily had become his entire universe. "I don't think about the future much," Daniel admitted one evening as they watched children play on a nearby swing set. "I just think about making sure Lily feels safe today. I didn't think there was room for anything else in my life. I thought I was done with new beginnings." Sophia, in turn, spoke of the hollow nature of her success. She talked about the parents who only called when they needed a donation to their foundation, and the friends who disappeared the moment the stock price dipped. "My life is a beautiful glass box," she whispered, her voice cracking slightly. "Everyone admires it from the outside, but no one wants to live inside it with me. It's cold in there, Daniel." The turning point came when Lily finally met Sophia. Daniel had been hesitant, protective of his daughter's heart. He didn't want to introduce someone who might just be a passing shadow. But one Saturday, while they were at the park, Sophia joined them. Lily was shy at first, hiding behind Daniel's leg and clutching a worn-out teddy bear. But Sophia didn't try too hard. She didn't buy her expensive toys or try to win her over with fake enthusiasm. Instead, she sat on the grass, pulled out a notepad, and asked Lily about her drawings. Lily eventually pulled out a sketchbook and showed Sophia the family portrait with the gap. "Who is this going to be?" Sophia asked gently, pointing to the empty space beside the stick figure Daniel. Lily looked at her father, then back at Sophia with wide, inquisitive eyes. "I haven't finished it yet," the little girl said quietly. "I'm waiting to see who stays. People usually leave when it gets hard." The words hit Sophia like a physical weight. She realized that for Daniel and Lily, staying was the ultimate currency. It wasn't about gifts, wealth, or grand gestures. It was about the simple, radical act of presence, the choice to be there when the sun went down and when it rose again. Soon, Sophia began to visit the house. She experienced family life in its rawest form: the chaos of a Tuesday morning, the smell of burnt toast, the laughter over a board game with missing pieces. She found herself doing things she never thought she would: folding laundry while watching cartoons, helping Lily with her math homework, and even learning how to braid hair from a YouTube tutorial. She felt more like a CEO of a household than she ever did of a corporation. She was choosing to be there, not because it was her job, but because it was her joy. Daniel watched her from the kitchen doorway one morning as she sat on the floor with Lily, building a castle out of wooden blocks. Sophia was laughing, a bright, uninhibited sound that filled the house and chased away the lingering shadows. In that moment, Daniel realized he wasn't half empty anymore. The gap in the drawing was beginning to color itself in with vibrant shades of hope, but with that realization came a looming fear that kept him awake at night. They lived in two vastly different worlds. He was a man who fixed pipes and lived paycheck to paycheck. She was a woman who owned the buildings he worked in. He worried about the judgment of her peers and the reality of their age gap. She was 45, established, and nearing a stage of life where his young daughter's needs, school runs, tantrums, and endless energy might feel like a burden rather than a blessing. He wondered if he was being selfish by letting her in. The connection was undeniable, but the world was starting to notice. The unnamed relationship between a titan of industry and a maintenance man was about to face its first and perhaps most devastating storm. The storm broke with a headline in a prominent business journal that sent shockwaves through the corporate world. A paparazzi photo had captured Sophia and Daniel at a local grocery store, both laughing as they carried bags of frozen peas and orange juice. The media called it Sophia's scandalous step-down. The board of directors at Laurent Global was horrified. They saw Daniel not as a man, but as a liability, a distraction that made their CEO look common and unfocused during a critical merger phase. Sophia was called into an emergency board meeting. The room was cold, filled with men in gray suits who had never known a day of manual labor. "You are the face of this company, Sophia," the chairman said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Associating with a technician? It sends the wrong message to our investors. It suggests a lack of judgment. You need to choose a partner who reflects your status, someone who understands the weight of your position and the prestige of the Laurent name." Sophia felt the familiar walls of her glass box closing in. She was being told that her happiness was a threat to her empire. At the same time, her family reached out, not to check on her well-being, but to warn her that she was embarrassing the lineage. They suggested she marry a wealthy venture capitalist, 10 years her senior, who had been pursuing her for months. "He's an equal," her mother had said over the phone. "This man Hayes is just a phase. Think about your legacy." The pressure mounted until it became a suffocating fog. Sophia found herself pulling away from Daniel, missing their weekend walks, and taking longer to return his texts as she battled to save her professional reputation. Daniel noticed the shift immediately. He was a man who understood when a system was under too much stress. He knew when the gears were grinding. He invited her to dinner, not at his home, but at a quiet, high-end restaurant where they could talk without the distraction of Lily's laughter or the mess of the kitchen. The atmosphere was heavy, the air tasting of impending endings and unspoken apologies. Sophia looked stunning in a black silk dress, but her eyes were guarded and weary. She was back in her armor, the CEO persona firmly in place. After a long, painful silence, Sophia finally spoke. She talked about the board, the media's obsession with her personal life, and the impossible expectations of her world. Then she looked at him, her voice trembling with the vulnerability she had tried so hard to hide. "They say this is a mistake, Daniel. They say we don't fit in any world that matters. And maybe they're right. Look at us. My life is a series of spreadsheets and scandals. My world is judgmental and cruel." She paused, her eyes searching his for a sign of hesitation. "And there's more. I'm 45. You're in your 30s. And you have a young child who needs a mother for the next 20 years. I'm at a different stage. I'm worried that I'm taking up space in a life where I don't belong. Is my age, is it a problem for you?" The question hung in the air like a suspended drop of rain, heavy with the fear of rejection. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He didn't offer a cliché about age being just a number. He looked down at the table, his rough fingers tracing the grain of the wood, reflecting on the weight of her words. The silence stretched until it felt like a physical barrier between them. Then he looked up. His gaze was steady, his voice low and filled with a truth that bypassed all the noise of the boardrooms and the headlines. "I've spent my life fixing things that are broken, Sophia. I know the value of something that lasts versus something that just looks good on the outside. If Lily needs someone to stay, if I need someone who understands that a home is built on truth rather than titles, then your age has never been the problem. In fact, your experience, your wisdom, that's what makes you who you are." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The only problem is whether you're brave enough to be the person in that drawing on my fridge. Because to Lily, you're not a CEO. You're just the person who stayed." Sophia froze. The words pierced through the CEO exterior and reached the woman beneath who had been starving for such simple, unconditional acceptance. He wasn't asking her to give up her company or her ambition. He was asking her to stop giving up on her own heart. He was telling her that her value wasn't in her youth or her bank account, but in her willingness to remain when things got difficult. In that moment, the power shifted. Sophia realized that the venture capitalists, the board, and her family were all offering her status, a shiny, empty shell. But Daniel was offering her stature, a foundation of real love. He was offering her a place where she didn't have to be formidable. She just had to be present. She didn't answer him with words. She reached across the table and took his calloused hand in hers. Her eyes were red with unshed tears, but for the first time in years, the formidable Sophia Loren allowed herself to be seen. She had made her choice. She wasn't going back to the glass box, no matter how much the world screamed. The aftermath was a slow, deliberate reconstruction of their shared reality. Sophia didn't quit her job, but she radically redefined it. She stepped back from the day-to-day minutiae that drained her soul, delegating power to a new generation of leaders she trusted. She made it clear to the board that her personal life was no longer a topic for discussion. Some investors left in a huff, but many stayed, impressed by her renewed clarity, her decisive leadership, and her newfound strength. She began spending almost every evening at Daniel's house. He had a small, overgrown garden in the back that had been a source of guilt for him since his wife's passing. It was a tangle of weeds, thorns, and dry earth, a living symbol of the parts of his life he had stopped tending to because the pain was too great. Sophia, who had never planted anything more than a desk succulent, decided that this would be their project, a way to grow something new together. They worked together on the weekends, their laughter echoing over the fence. Daniel did the heavy digging, clearing the old dead roots and turning the soil, while Sophia spent hours researching the best perennials and herbs for the climate. Lily was the head of watering, running around with a small green can, soaking the plants and occasionally the adults. As they worked, they talked about the future, not as a looming threat or a corporate strategy, but as a garden they were carefully planting. "I used to think my life had to be a certain way to be correct," Sophia said one afternoon, her face smudged with dirt and her hair tied back in a messy bun. "I thought I had to be perfect to be worthy of respect. But out here, with my hands in the dirt, I realize that things only grow when they're messy and vulnerable. There's beauty in the struggle of a seed pushing through the earth." Daniel smiled, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "The dirt is where the strength comes from, Sophia. You can't grow anything real in a glass box. It's too sterile. It doesn't have the nutrients of experience or the moisture of tears. This is real." During this time, the gap in Lily's drawing began to change in a way that moved them both to silence. Lily didn't just add a generic mother figure. She started adding specific details to the white space. She drew a woman with black hair, a blue dress, and a small briefcase. Someone who looked remarkably like Sophia. One evening, Lily shyly showed the updated drawing to Sophia while they were sitting on the porch. "Is that me?" Sophia asked, her voice trembling as she traced the crayon lines. "Yes," Lily said, hugging her sketchbook tightly. "Because you didn't leave when the cameras came and made you sad. Daddy said you stayed because you're brave, and brave people belong in our family." Gushkern. The high point of this period was a small, quiet dinner at the house to celebrate the first blooms in the garden. No board members were invited, no paparazzi were allowed, and there were no expectations of status. Just Daniel, Sophia, and Lily. They sat around the mismatched wooden table, eating a meal they had cooked together, spaghetti and meatballs that were slightly overcooked, but tasted better than any Michelin-starred meal Sophia had ever had. She realized that she didn't miss the champagne toast of her old life. She felt full in a way that had nothing to do with her net worth. But there was still one more step to take. The transition wasn't just about weekends and gardens. It was about a permanent commitment to a shared life. Lily, with the brutal honesty of a child, finally asked the question that had been hovering in the air for months during a quiet moment before bed. "Are you going to stay forever, Sophia? Or are you just visiting until you get busy again?" Sophia looked at Daniel, who was standing by the door. He didn't pressure her. He didn't try to answer for her. He just waited, giving her the space to make her own choice, knowing that a forced answer was no answer at all. "We don't have to decide every single thing today, Lily," Daniel said gently, sensing Sophia's hesitation. We just have to decide to be here tomorrow. That's how forever is built, one tomorrow at a time. It was a profound lesson in patience for Sophia. She was no longer rushing to meet the world's deadlines or the board's quarterly expectations. She was learning to live on heart time, where the only deadline was the sunset and the only goal was the peace of her family. The final choice, the one that solidified their future, came on a gray, rainy Tuesday morning that tested everyone's resolve. Sophia had an incredibly important merger meeting in the city, one that had been months in the making and involved billions of dollars. But Lily had come down with a sudden, high fever in the middle of the night. Daniel was prepared to handle it alone, as he had handled every crisis for 7 years. He was already calling out of work, looking for the thermometer, and preparing a pot of soup. Sophia stood in the doorway of the living room with her expensive trench coat on, her leather briefcase in hand. Her phone was buzzing incessantly in her pocket with messages from her assistant and frantic calls from the chairman. She looked at Daniel, who was tired but steady, and then at Lily, who was curled up on the sofa under a mountain of blankets, her face flushed with fever. She looked at her phone. She looked at the door leading back to her high-stakes world. And then she looked at the little girl who was waiting to see who stayed. Without a word, Sophia took off her coat and draped it over a chair. She set her briefcase down on the floor. I'm staying, Sophia said, her voice filled with a calm certainty. Sophia, the merger, this is the biggest deal of your career. Daniel started, his eyes wide with surprise. I can handle this. I've always handled it. The merger can wait or it can fail. It doesn't matter, she interrupted, kneeling beside the sofa and placing a cool hand on Lily's forehead. This is where I'm needed. This is the life I chose. And a life isn't lived in boardrooms. It's lived here, in the quiet moments when things are hard. I'm not a visitor anymore, Daniel. I'm home. She spent the entire day on the sofa with Lily, reading her stories from tattered books, singing off-key songs, and cooling her forehead with a damp cloth. Daniel watched her from the kitchen, and for the first time in his life, he felt a sense of complete security. This wasn't a temporary arrangement or a romantic whim. This was a family. That evening, as the rain turned into a soft mist and Lily finally fell into a deep, healing sleep, Sophia and Daniel sat on the porch together. The garden they had planted was drinking in the rain, the small green shoots looking strong and vibrant. You really stayed, Daniel said, his voice filled with a quiet, profound awe. Even when the whole world was calling you back to the palace. I realized that I spent 45 years building a kingdom, but I only needed a few months with you and Lily to find a home, Sophia replied, leaning her head on his shoulder. The palace was empty, Daniel. This house, it's full. My age, my job, my past. None of it matters as much as the person I am when I'm sitting here with you. I finally understand what you meant about stature. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple ring. It wasn't a diamond the size of a grape, and it didn't come with a press release. It was a modest band of recycled gold. Something steady, enduring, and honest, like the man himself. I don't have a kingdom to offer you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Just a life that's been repaired, and a heart that belongs to you. But if you'll have it, I'd like to keep fixing things and growing things with you for the rest of our lives. Sophia looked at the ring, then at the man who had seen her soul when she was invisible to everyone else. She didn't think about the board or the merger. She thought about the drawing on the fridge. Welcome home, Daniel, she whispered, letting him slide the ring onto her finger. Lily woke up the next morning, her fever gone and her spirit bright. She ran to the kitchen and found a new drawing waiting for her on the refrigerator. It was the same family portrait, but the gap was completely gone, filled in with bright, confident colors. In its place was Sophia, holding hands with Daniel and Lily in their garden. At the bottom, in Lily's careful, proud handwriting, it said, Our family, we stayed. The garden eventually bloomed into a riot of color, a local landmark of beauty. The company thrived under a leader who finally knew the true value of her own time and the power of her own heart. And the single dad who had spent his life fixing machines finally found the one thing he couldn't fix with a wrench. a love that was built to last, proving that sometimes the best parts of life happen when you're brave enough to stop running and just stay. Love doesn't begin with perfection. It begins when someone chooses to stay. It doesn't matter who you were before, what title you hold, or how many years have passed. What matters is the person who stands beside you when the world tells you to move on. True wealth isn't found in what you build alone in a glass box, but in the family you choose to grow with in the dirt. Thank you for listening to this emotional journey on High TL Stories. If Daniel and Sophia's story of choosing love over status warmed your heart, please don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next journey of love. Your support is what drives us to spread more healing every day.